Do you remember the sound a factory made before you ever saw it? The low mechanical hum that reached the sidewalk a full block before the gate, the way the pavement itself seemed to carry a faint vibration up through the soles of your shoes. The smell of hot machine oil and scorched metal drifting out through open bay doors even in January. Maybe you remember standing at a chain-link fence as a kid, waiting for your father's shift to end, watching sparks arc off a grinding wheel somewhere deep inside a building that seemed to breathe. That specific, layered sensation is almost gone from American life now, and it's worth remembering exactly why. Before we get into it, if you haven't already, take a second to subscribe and hit the bell, because this channel exists to remember the America we actually lived through. Not just the headlines and the anniversaries, but the ordinary textures, sounds, and rhythms of daily life that don't make it into history books. Today, we're stepping onto the factory floor of the 1950s. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand it in a way you never have before. The story of the mid-century American factory floor really starts with a man named Frederick Taylor decades earlier. But it was the post-war boom, roughly 1945 through the early 1960s, that turned his ideas about scientific management into the physical architecture you're picturing right now. After World War II, American manufacturers faced an unprecedented problem. Enormous pent-up consumer demand, from washing machines to automobiles to televisions, and a workforce of returning veterans who needed jobs immediately. Companies like General Motors, Westinghouse, and General Electric didn't just need more workers. They needed factories redesigned from the ground up to move raw material to finished product as efficiently as physically possible, and that single obsession, efficiency as a design philosophy, shaped every square foot of the floor you walked onto. You'd typically enter through a time clock room, and that clock itself deserves a moment because it wasn't incidental. The punch clock, refined and mass-produced by companies like IBM's predecessor, the International Time Recording Company, and by Simplex Time Recorder out of Gardner, Massachusetts, was the first object every worker touched each day. Its mechanical chunk was the sound of your labor becoming real. From there, you'd move into a locker room with rows of gray or olive green steel lockers, usually made by companies like Lion Metal Products, the paint already chipping at the hinges from years of use. And the air there had its own particular smell. Damp canvas work gloves, machine grease that never quite washed out of denim, and the faint chemical sting of the industrial soap in the sink. Stepping onto the floor itself, the first thing that hit you was scale. Ceilings often ran 20, 30, even 40 feet high, supported by exposed steel truss work, because these buildings needed to house overhead cranes. Massive traveling bridge cranes running on rails bolted near the roofline, capable of hoisting engine blocks or steel coils weighing several tons, and moving them the length of a building the size of several football fields. The floor itself was almost always poured concrete, often 6 to 8 inches thick, sometimes with a woodblock surface in areas where workers stood for hours, because plain concrete was brutal on the legs and back over a 10-hour shift. You'd feel that floor through your boots by midday, a dull ache that became so routine most men stopped noticing it. The light was its own character entirely. Factories built or expanded in this era relied heavily on sawtooth roof designs, and rows of steel sash windows, sometimes hundreds of individual panes, angled specifically to bring in diffuse northern light that wouldn't create harsh shadows or glare on precision work. When electric lighting supplemented it, you'd see banks of mercury vapor lamps casting that distinctive blue-white glow, or in older sections, still some incandescent fixtures hanging from long cords, swaying almost imperceptibly whenever a crane passed overhead. The windows themselves were rarely clean. Decades of soot and grime built up on the glass, so even at noon, the light inside had a filtered, almost underwater quality. Then there was the noise. And this is the detail people forget most completely, because we simply don't experience anything like it anymore. A stamping press punching sheet steel could produce a sound close to 110 decibels, comparable to a jackhammer, and it repeated every few seconds for an entire shift. pneumatic riveting guns, drop hammers, the whine of lathes and milling machines, the clatter of conveyor chains. It all combined into a continuous industrial roar that most workers simply learned to shout through, and hearing protection as we know it today was rare to non-existent. Many men who worked those floors into the 1970s and beyond carried permanent hearing damage. As an unspoken cost of the job, something rarely discussed at the time, but well documented by occupational health researchers looking back. You'd walk past the assembly line itself, which by the 1950s had been refined, well beyond Henry Ford's original 1913 moving line at Highland Park. Conveyor speeds were now calculated with genuine precision, timed against standard minutes for each task, a practice formalized by industrial engineers trained in the Taylorist tradition, and reinforced by time and motion studies conducted with stopwatches and clipboards. Workers each had a defined station, often no more than 4 to 6 feet of line, and the same specific motion repeated hundreds of times a shift. Tightening a particular bolt, welding a particular seam, installing a particular gasket. The line didn't wait for you. That rhythm, imposed by the machine rather than chosen by the worker, was one of the most psychologically significant shifts in American labor history. And you felt it in your body every single day you stood there. But here's the thing people rarely talk about when they picture these places with pure nostalgia. That same brutal, exhausting, deafening environment was also one of the most powerful engines of shared economic mobility this country has ever produced. By the mid-1950s, thanks largely to the organizing efforts of unions like the United Auto Workers under Walter Reuther and the United Steelworkers, a man with a high school diploma or less could walk onto that punishing factory floor and, within a few years, earn enough to buy a modest house, support a family on one income, and retire with a pension. The floor was loud and dangerous and physically punishing, yes. But it was also, for a specific and historically narrow window, one of the only paths in American life where raw physical labor converted directly and reliably into middle-class stability. That contradiction is the actual heart of the story. And it's far more complicated than either pure nostalgia or pure grievance. The factory floor also forced a kind of unplanned social intimacy that's almost entirely disappeared from modern work. You knew the man on your left and your right not because you chose them as friends, but because your physical survival and your production quota depended on watching out for each other near moving machinery. Break rooms were loud, crowded, communal spaces where union stewards, foremen, and line workers crossed paths constantly, where grievances got aired in person and relationships got built across ethnic and generational lines that post-war America was otherwise still deeply segregated by. You didn't get to work in isolation. The architecture of the building itself, with its open floor plan and shared machinery, made isolation physically impossible. So what changed? Why did that specific floor, loud, dangerous, communal, physically demanding, largely vanish from American life? The reasons are concrete and well documented, not simply nostalgia curdling into decline narrative. First, automation accelerated dramatically, starting in the late 1950s and through the 1960s and 70s, with the first industrial robot, Unimate, installed at a General Motors plant in Ewing Township, New Jersey, in 1961, beginning a slow but eventually decisive replacement of repetitive human tasks with programmable machinery. Second, global competition intensified sharply after Japanese and later South Korean manufacturers, rebuilding with newer equipment and different labor cost structures, began outcompeting American firms on price and, eventually, quality, particularly in steel and automobiles through the 1970s and 80s. Third, regulatory change reshaped the floor itself. The creation of OSHA in 1970 mandated real improvements in noise control, machine guarding, and ventilation, genuinely reducing injury and death rates, but also raising compliance costs that pushed some manufacturers to relocate or automate further rather than retrofit aging buildings. Fourth, and perhaps most decisively, corporate strategy shifted toward offshoring production to Mexico and later China and Southeast Asia, chasing lower labor costs, especially accelerating after trade agreements like NAFTA in 1994, and China's accession to the World Trade Organization in 2001. Union membership in manufacturing, which had covered roughly a third of the private sector workforce, at its 1950s peak, fell to a small fraction of that by the early 2000s, and with it went much of the bargaining power that had made the factory floor a viable path to a stable life. It would be dishonest to pretend everything about that vanished floor deserves mourning. Modern manufacturing facilities are quieter, dramatically safer, better lit with efficient LED systems calibrated for actual human visual comfort rather than industrial necessity, and far less likely to leave a worker permanently injured or deaf by age 50. Robotics and automated guided vehicles have removed enormous amounts of the crushing, repetitive physical strain that defined a shift on that old line. Climate control exists now in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to a man sweating through a Midwestern summer next to a foundry in 1954. Those are genuine, substantial gains, and no honest accounting of the past should pretend otherwise. But something real was lost alongside those gains, and it wasn't simply nostalgia talking. The modern manufacturing floor, with its smaller workforce and higher automation, rarely produces that same dense, forced, cross-generational community that the old floor built almost as an accidental byproduct of its brutal design, the stable, single-income, high school diploma path to home ownership. That floor once offered has narrowed to something far rarer and far more precarious. You gained safety and quiet and precision. You lost a certain kind of common ground that used to exist among people, who otherwise had very little reason to know each other at all. So I want to ask you honestly, did you or someone in your family ever punch a time clock, work a line, or stand at a station on a factory floor like the one we just walked through? What do you remember most clearly? The sound, the smell, the exhaustion, or the people standing beside you? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely love to know.